Logic and temporal sequence are not the only factors that influence the structure of texts. Another very important factor is sound. This is most obvious in poetry and music. In English, these forms, especially music, are characterized by rhyme and meter. Attempting to preserve the rhyme and meter of original music and poetry, while at the same time preserving the information content, presents a particular challenge for translators. Since changes to meter are especially damaging to a song's singability, and changes to its rhyme structure damage its attractiveness, it is quite often the content that is altered to fit the form. Religious music includes some of the most translated texts of all times, and these provide many examples of the variety of solutions that translators have employed when confronted with the challenge of translating songs. Different translations of Martin Luther's hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," provide an accessible illustration. Here we see the German original, with an English translation of each word underneath in blue. These texts in red and green are two of the English renditions that have been produced through the centuries. Note that the one in green, which you are probably most familiar with, does a better job fitting the words to the meter and replicating the rhyme scheme of the original, while the red version sticks more closely to the original words and structure. Which do you think is a better translation? In the grand scheme of things, translating German songs into English is fairly easy. These two languages are closely related, and the cultures and worldviews of the people who speak them have overlapped for centuries. Translation typically becomes more difficult the more the languages and cultures involved diverge. Translating songs composed in European languages for Western cultures into forms appropriate to cultures in the global South can be particularly challenging. Music in these cultures often uses a pentatonic scale, and songs are often structured antiphonally. When the target language is tonal, there are often extra constraints on word choice and melodic structure. The importance of the interplay of sound and meaning is not confined to poetry and music. Ambiguity, for example, can arise when the pronunciation of the labels of different categories sound the same, but their denotative meanings are different. In Video 8, we considered puns, innuendo, and other ways that our culture uses ambiguity. The particular interaction of sound, denotation, and culture that these devices require to succeed is often impossible to replicate in other languages. What's more, other cultures employ ambiguity for different purposes. All of this makes translating intentional ambiguity especially challenging. To get a feel for this challenge, let's consider a couple of puns in French. The first one can be translated, "Why did the sheep chew gum?" "He heard it was good for his breath." This works as a pun in French because, in this instance, French uses articles where English would use possessive pronouns, and because the French words for the breath sound like the French words for the wool. The humor, such as it is, derives from the sheep in question mistaking breath for wool. The translation challenge arises because the success of the pun depends on the terms for breath and wool sounding the same, and in English, they simply don't. So what's the best way to translate this into English? Your answer to that will depend on what, for you, is most important to achieve. Specifically, is it more important that the target audience infer the existence of a sheep which is chewing gum to improve its breath, or that they notice a play on words? It would, of course, be preferable to retain both of these, but in the event that you can't come up with a way to do so, what would you choose? The easiest approach is to retain the original reference at the expense of the joke. If you choose this solution, you can always include a footnote explaining the ambiguity in the original, but doing so is unlikely to elicit a laugh, or even a groan. If you decide that preserving the pun's humor is more important than the reference of the words used in the original, you might decide to substitute an English pun for the French one. You might even use a pun featuring sheep. Might one of these work? In what situations would such a substitution be acceptable, and in which situations would it not? In what situations would it be important for the translator to explain the issue to the recipients of the translation? Here's another French pun. This one works because this Ave Maria, which means the Hail Mary, sounds the same as this Ave Maria, which means to wash Mary. But this time the challenge is not only the play on words, it is also reproducing the cultural nuances that the joke evokes. It holds the possibility of being both religiously and ethnically offensive in both the source and target cultures. How should the translator handle that? Let's think first about the implied ethnic slight. A joke about Belgians is probably going to be received much differently in Europe than it would be in the US, or anywhere else for that matter. Would the translator want to keep the Belgians involved, or substitute another nationality to get bigger laughs from the target audience on the local scene? Or should she get rid of any ethnic references at all to avoid being politically incorrect? Or keep the original reference to convey what was in the original? The answers to these questions depend on the translator's purpose and the expectations of the target audience as much as anything else. Of course, there's also the challenge of finding a way to express the pun. Maybe she could substitute a football for the bucket. What do you think? Translating puns suggests an approach to translating our original example sentence in the original context. In video 3, this sentence was useful not because key and trunk denoted any particular thing, but rather because, since these words can denote objects in several diverse categories, the sentence was ideal for demonstrating the ambiguity inherent in language and the necessity of context to infer the meaning of messages. The function of the sentence, as an illustrative example, is more important to the overall argument than is any particular meaning we can attach to it or to the words that make it up. We've already seen that we can't find category labels in other languages that have the same range of meaning as key and trunk. But can we find other words in the target language that will allow us to construct a sentence that will serve to illustrate the same point? In cases like these, the translator faces a dilemma. Which would be a more faithful translation? A sentence that allows the target audience to infer at least some of the possible reference that key and trunk can denote, or a sentence that best illustrates the point that the original author is trying to make? In video 23, we considered an extreme case in which the choice between prioritizing the meanings of words and prioritizing the intent of the original author would take the translator in very different directions. In that example, a message is composed of a string of words that were chosen because, when they are pronounced in sequence, a series of sounds is produced that resembles a different string of words, to which quite a different meaning can be attributed. Is this bit of text translatable? Your answer to that will depend on what you want the translation to do for you. You can probably find words in most languages that will serve as acceptable equivalents of most of the words in the string. You can also probably find a way to invite someone to go dancing in most languages, though what going dancing may entail may be quite different from one culture to the next. In many languages, you can probably find a different string of words that sound like the words that serve as equivalents to the original string of words, though the sound systems and grammar of some languages seriously limit the extent to which this can be done. What you probably can't do is accomplish all three of these things with a single string of words. This means you have to choose which is the most important for what you want your translation to achieve. A fourth choice, of course, would be to come up with a sentence in the target language whose meaning is different, but whose acoustic structure allows the same kind of interplay between sound and meaning as the original. These examples illustrate the need to consider what we called impact in video 24. Impact, broadly speaking, is the effect that a text has on its audience. Should a translator aim to produce a translated text that has the same effect on the target audience as the original text had on the original audience? In practice, this is hard to achieve and even harder to evaluate. Quite often, we can only guess what a text's effect on its original audience might have been. Logically, we would only expect a translation to have a similar impact on a target audience if the values and circumstances that characterize the target audience are very close to those of the original audience, which is almost never the case. Nonetheless, Gauging the target audience's response to a translation is an important step in the translation process. If their response is radically different to what the translator expected, the translator should probably reevaluate the translation. If it is apparent that the original text brought the recipients to tears and the translated text routinely provokes laughter, there might be something wrong. If the original text sought to convey the dangers of smoking and the translation seems to be encouraging the target audience to light up, the translator might want to find out why. Two other target audience responses that may also be worth evaluating are what they think of the quality of the text and what they make of the author. If the original text was emotionally moving or considered a work of art, most people would agree that any translation of it should reflect those qualities. But what if the original text was confusing, convoluted, or obscure? Should the translated text also be confusing, convoluted, or obscure? If the original employed poor grammar or limited vocabulary, should the translation do so as well? If the original author came across as bombastic, prejudiced, poorly educated, or untrustworthy, should the translator attempt to use vocabulary and grammar in the target language that would convey these same traits? This will depend on the translator's objective, which is closely linked to the use to which the translation is to be put. Is the translator seeking to accomplish what the original author was seeking to accomplish, or to convey to the target audience how the original author went about accomplishing it? A translation challenge that illustrates how pursuing one or the other of these two objectives can result in different outcomes is the translation of bad translations. For example, these pool rules, apparently translated from Hebrew, are amusing for English speakers, but may be so confusing in their translated form that they contribute nothing to the safety of the swimming public. Now, suppose you wanted to translate the English version of these rules into Spanish or Hindi. Would you translate them in a way that reflects the amusing nature of the bad English translation, or in a way that reflects the intent of the original Hebrew? It would depend on whether you wanted your translation to keep people safe or to make people laugh. Translation decisions often come down to a choice between retaining features of the original text in the text of the translation and making the meaning of the text clear for a new audience. While translators usually make an effort to do both, the nature of language often requires that they favor one of these goals at the expense of the other.